Hello, welcome to the Humane Hangouts podcast. So, to be completely honest, this was a conversation I recorded last night, and then I woke up this morning feeling both incredibly ill, but also kind of annoyed that I realised I forgot to record a proper introduction to this conversation. So I put the same jumper on, ready to deceive you, and I thought, I'm just going to be honest with this. So, yeah, this was a conversation I had last night with Simon Eckerström Liedholm, and he works at Wild Animal Initiative. He has a PhD in zoology, and Wild Animal Initiative are an organisation that are conducting research to learn about the lives of wild animals with the aim of making their lives better. And as you may know, I have been talking about wild animal suffering for quite some time on my main YouTube channel now. So it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to someone who's actually involved in the research. So one of the observations I've made when talking to vegans about the issue of wild animal suffering is that while people often are able to get on board in principle, if we can help wild animals, we should. A lot of people have the understandable concern that ecosystems are so incredibly interconnected and complex and large. How can we possibly make a significant difference while being sure that we're not making things significantly worse? So it's really great for me to be able to have a conversation with someone who knows a lot more about ecology than I do, and someone who's out there doing the research that's going to help us answer these important questions. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about that concern. We also talked a fair amount about a potential intervention that he's quite optimistic about, which is the use of contraception on wild animals. Oh, and as well as forgetting to record this introduction last night, I also think I made another mistake. So I pulled the battery out of my camera before I clicked the button to stop recording, and I think that's caused me to lose the first hour of my video footage. And I know that most of you guys only watch my YouTube channel to see my amazing face, so I'm really sorry about that. You can still hear my clear audio, and thankfully I'm not as bunged up and ill as I am now in the actual recording of the conversation. But I guess I'll just put a picture of my face to remind you of who I am while you're listening to me talk for the first hour. Apologies about that. But Simon does most of the talking anyway, and yeah, he's ultimately the person that has got the most interesting stuff to say on this topic, I think. So hopefully you find value in this conversation. And yeah, after around the first hour, my face will be moving again. So sorry about that. And yeah, thanks so much for your interest in this topic, and hope you enjoy the conversation.
I think for nature documentaries, it seems to be commonplace to actually edit out the worst parts, and it means that people get a consistently biased picture. I mean, in many ways they do, because it's very hard to capture all of nature all at once and then absorb it. But that seems like something that could explain some of the sort of rosy picture that some people tend to have. I don't know, but I guess it's it's. I can see why if you want to have something to show kids, for instance, you don't want to traumatize them.
And I guess the main goal is entertainment, not showing people what life is like in nature.
Yeah.
But it's a shame that the people producing these documentaries are aware that that's all happening. There's an animal maybe being eaten alive for hours on end, but then they still create such a romanticized view.
Yeah.
There's a documentary by David Attenborough that's actually called The Perfect Planet.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Or a Perfect Planet. I'm not sure, but
yeah. I guess it's that's a high bar. Perfect planet. You wouldn't make any changes.
Yeah, it wouldn't change a thing.
I mean, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't agree to that. Obviously, there's things humans do that he talks about all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of vague. He might just mean I think in the trailer he says something everything works in perfect balance or something. And as they're showing, as the word perfect comes out, they're showing loads of fish being eaten by a whale. But it's it looks cool, because it's a huge whale and they have all this really dramatic music. But you're still seeing animals being eaten alive and it's perfect. It's what? Crazy.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I've seen an interview where he was actually asked, like, should we, when we see an animal being hurt, should we intervene? And he basically gave a hypothetical scenario. He's like, let's say that you see a cheetah coming up to like a baby deer or something, and you have an intuition to be like, rah, and like scare the deer away so it runs off. But actually what you've done there is the baby deer has then been separated from their parents, so they're going to die anyway, and the cheetah like might go hungry. So he kind of gave this hypothetical scenario where he would like have this intervention where he's made things worse. That was kind of the conclusion. But it's like, just because you can come up with like one specific scenario where like you've made things worse doesn't mean that every possible intervention is going to make things worse. Like, that's crazy. Yeah. So he didn't like go very deeply into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's a common tendency for people to answer those questions that way. Like I understand sort of the impulse to want to caveat it, like, we don't really know, we could be having the opposite effect. But I think it's just, I don't know, it's very unlikely that every single possible example you could think of would actually end up, like, it's almost like you could do the reverse in order to, you could just like, if that was a consistent
grab
pattern,
a deer and put it in front of the cheetah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but like, it just seems like if there's a consistent pattern, then you would be able to exploit it. And if there's not, you're just gonna sometimes randomly do something that's good. And so the question is like, can we figure out whether certain action like reliably produce positive outcomes? It seems like the more interesting question.
I think maybe a good place to start would be to get a little overview of what your role is with Wild Animal Initiative and kind of how you ended up getting involved in the first place.
Yeah. So my role currently is, so my title is researcher, and what I do, there's a few different things. So one of the main things is to try to sort of answer some key questions that we have that will influence what we think that sort of future research on wild animal welfare would benefit from. Like, what areas should we focus on, and what questions are the most important? That is, I'd say, the main thing. I'm also helping out with other things like the grants program that we have. So looking at grant applications and looking at the what questions people who apply for grants are looking at, and then giving input on what we think would be the most sort of pressing projects or the most useful ones. Those, I guess, are the two main things. And then it's a lot about sort of the strategic planning of what we're sort of focusing on in terms of research.
And when did you first hear about when did you first really consider the issue of wild animal suffering? And was it like intuitive to you, or did you have some objections? And kind of what led to you deciding to kind of work on this with your career?
I think I talked to some of my philosopher friends. I think that's how I ended up sort of thinking about it, more than just like a state of the world. Bad things happen in nature. That it's sort of an observation that I had made, but I guess, I didn't put it in any sort of connection with what I do in relation to that. I think that was like, I had an interest in philosophy. I was studying biology. So basically like a hobby interest in philosophy. I was studying biology. And I quit eating meat several years earlier, And so I think it was it seemed very reasonable, the sort of core arguments. At that point, I felt I didn't know much. I hadn't spent enough time thinking about it, but it seemed like just a basic argument of, well, you have concern for other animals, you have concern for, well, in general, sort of sentient beings. Then, if you apply this consistently, wouldn't you also care for the plight of wild animals? And so I think that seemed like for me, it was not actually that big a step. I was just sort of trying to apply the same logic and reasoning consistently, and that was a sort of very natural expansion of my thinking.
So before you talked to your friends, I guess you had some friends who were also interested in philosophy, and they kind of put the case forward to you. Before that, did you have a kind of romanticized or idyllic image of nature? Did you have some kind of shift in your thinking that changed there?
So I don't. So I would say I probably didn't have a sort of romantic picture of nature. I remember sending, do you know The Onion, the sort of satirical news site? There was one article where it mentions the number of animals killed by natural selection, and the article was written as if like natural selection is basically on a killing spree, killing 38 quadrillion organisms this day or something like that. And so I sent it to him because I think it was like just as a sort of as a joke, but obviously thinking that there's something to it. And I should say that I think the numbers there were for organisms, and also it's a satirical paper, so I'm not sure to what extent it's factual. But yeah, I thought it was interesting that I guess it shows my view of, at that point, of sort of natural world being sort of amoral in a sense, not being benevolent or having some purpose, or at least not in terms of that there's no sort of guiding force in terms of welfare or well-being. And so yeah, that way I think I was pretty convinced that there's, to the extent that the world is good or bad, it's to a large extent just an accident or sort of amoral processes, so to speak, that produce that. Yeah, I think I had this question of whether the world was sort of good or bad compared to what it could have been. So I guess in philosophy that would be like an axiological question, like what state of the world is better than another state. That I had thought about, but I hadn't thought about more of a deontic question, I think is what the term. Basically, what I ought to do in relation to that. I just hadn't asked myself the question. And so if I would have at that point, I'm not sure what I would have answered, but I guess I just didn't think of that at the point.
What would you say is the main case for wild animal suffering? How would you summarize the argument for prioritizing this?
Yeah, so I think it depends a bit on what sort of moral framework you're working from, but I guess the best way to start is just to sort of look at what are some common intuitions about our obligations to other beings, I guess. And so it's quite natural for most people to care about other humans, and care about maybe their pets or other people's pets if they know them. And I think that's like, obviously share that intuition. Like, I do care about all of those. And then I think from there on, it's just a question of trying to have internally consistent beliefs and trying to figure out a way in which you could like describe your moral beliefs, your ethical framework, in a way that isn't sort of self-contradicting or something like that. And so to sort of explain what I mean by that, I think if you think about humans, to make the case easy, you think about humans close to you, that it's like most people care about their immediate family. I think it's like there's a case to be made that it shouldn't really matter how close they are to you, in sort of in terms of relationships or in distance or time for that matter. And so if you then sort of expand outwards, you see that so okay, if we don't sort of discriminate based on sort of where you're from, how far away you are, when you're alive, or like how different you are, if it's a sentient being or someone with the capacity to experience positive and negative emotions. I personally think that we should sort of extend our compassion for those individuals as well. I was basically trying to explain that why we should, in principle, care about wild animals, and I think it's a matter of extrapolating from caring about humans that are further away from us, animals that are different from us in different ways, like pets and farmed animals, for instance. And then further along that line, you'd have wild animals. I think it's common for people not to have thought about it that much. It's just not something that is something people usually do think about or care about. And so, but I think it's when you do start thinking about when you try to be consistent in like explaining to yourself and others, why do I value these experiences or these beings, and not others? Why do these experiences matter more than these? Then I think it becomes pretty clear that wild animals is just sort of a natural extension from farmed animals or pets.
Yeah, so like I guess I was involved in like the vegan activism community before I went into thinking about wild animal suffering, and I didn't have a romanticized view of nature either. Like I remember when I was young, like being very much affected by predation. Like in a David Attenborough documentary, seeing an animal being chased and then eating alive was like really bothered me, to the point where I remember my mum was like telling me, like, it's just something you got to get over, Jack. You just got to get over it. And like, here we are,
didn't get over
15
it.
Years later. Never got over it. But like I think when you, so you know, if you're someone who cares about animal suffering, and that's kind of what led you to say becoming vegan, which it was for me. Like it was very much like learning about the ways in which they're suffering, which completely blew my mind, which kind of caused me to go down the whole vegan rabbit hole. Well, I think if you like take a step back and then consider wild animals as well, it's like, well, it doesn't actually make a difference where the animal is. You know, if the animal is, whether it's in a cage or in someone's home or in a forest, like suffering feels the same. So I think like a lot of people can agree in principle that if we can help wild animals, we should. You know, their suffering matters. But I think a lot of people get stuck on the idea. Well, maybe stuck isn't the right word, but like a lot of people seem to be more concerned with how likely it is that we will be able to make a positive difference to the lives of wild animals reliably. So like a common kind of issue that's put forward is that ecosystems are so incredibly complex. You know, like we affect one animal and maybe we can have an improvement in their well-being, but then that's going to have knock-on effects that go down a trophic cascade and affect a whole bunch of other animals as well. And how can we even fathom like the potential outcomes of what we do? Ecosystems are so complex and interconnected, and we just don't understand them. And yeah, like, are you sympathetic to that concern? And yeah, like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, very much sympathetic to that. I guess at least in terms of sort of what we currently know and our current understanding of the different ecosystems, basically all of them. I think that is just something that is it goes for almost anything that we're doing. We're constantly making changes to our environment in different ways, and so that does have effects on ecosystems. Sometimes very specific effects. If you're logging in the forest and you'd see quite concretely, you would see fewer trees of the ones that you logged, but maybe other effects of like animals that are sort of pushed further into the forest or elsewhere because of the loss of habitat. So those are like some examples where you see that sort of we do make changes to the natural world regularly and sort of continuously in many different ways. It's usually or almost exclusively for the benefit of ourselves, so economic benefit or some other benefits. And I think that, I think there's reason to be sort of to be careful, to try to avoid making sort of irreversible changes. I think that it's making changes to the natural world on the basis of trying to improve welfare of wild animals. I would say in addition to other animals and humans, of course. So ideally, we wouldn't want to make changes that we think are good for wild animals, but that are really bad for humans, for instance, or bad for I don't know, farmed animals or something. I think that sort of the same logic applies in those cases. We want to make sure that any changes we make are sort of robustly positive, and that means that we need to do a lot of research to try to figure out what are the effects of our actions, and as I said, try to avoid those sort of strong lock-in effects where you make some irreversible change. I think doing research on current methods to manage populations, that is one thing where sort of we are already making this type of change, and measuring welfare outcomes as well would just be sort of a variation of what is already being done. And so in that case, it wouldn't necessarily affect anything sort of beyond what is already being done. Obviously,
Right. So are you
Yeah.
talking primarily about like conservation interventions, and you're saying, well, we could just start measuring how that, like the well-being of the animals that we can see are being affected by it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not necessarily just conservation. It could be any type of project where you're trying to mitigate the effects of a species that is causing problems for humans, if it's rodents or pigeons, for instance. And you want to just look at, okay, we are currently doing something. We're using different methods to sort of to control and reduce this sort of human wildlife conflict. And then that could be a good place to start looking at the welfare effects on wild animals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it very ironic how, we're kind of already, with all these kind of conservationist interventions, we're already doing interventions that are changing the experience of wild animals, like perhaps dramatically, but we're not even really trying to measure the effect on their well-being. But when someone says, well, we should start like doing some interventions to improve wild animal welfare, people will then come with the argument that, like, well, we'll inevitably make things worse. It's like, well, all we're saying is that we should like try to we're already doing interventions. So it's just interesting that people who talk about when conservationist policies are talked about, that doesn't really seem to be in the discussion. Like, well, how is this affecting the well-being of the animals involved?
Yeah, I think it's partly true. I think there are quite a number of people that are concerned about welfare effects, at least in terms of mitigating harms. So this area of research and I guess policy work as well, that's called compassionate conservation. So mainly focused on how do we do conservation without having negative welfare effects. That is at least my perception of it, because I think it's often focused on how do we mitigate harms, or maybe it's phrased as side effects or something like that, or the focus is try to avoid doing harm, and so I think that is sort of one of the important differences between my approach and Wild Animal Initiative's approach, and maybe the compassionate conservationist, where they maybe would focus primarily on, well, can we ensure that we've avoided causing harm, and then to some extent you're satisfied. Where I would say, I think it's important to look at the positive effects as well. We shouldn't forget those, and especially if you have some population or specific animal that is generally faring very poorly. If you have the ability to make their life better in some reliable way, then that seems like something positive. If you would have asked me, if I would, I don't know, if I had a headache and, okay, no, that's that's kind of a useless example. So maybe scrap that. Anyway, I think it's it's a common way of thinking. I think I see it in many parts of society that the avoiding harm has sort of primacy. Is that what you say? And secondarily, you think about whether something has a sort of positive benefit. I just don't think that those two are really different, or that there's a meaningful difference. And
What do you mean by primacy?
That you'd first determine whether there's any chance or more than a negligible risk of causing harm, and then after that you look at whether there's some like upside. And this is, I should say in particular, if you're doing something that they could sort of have external effects on other I don't know what it would be, but wild animals, obviously, but also I guess humans in some cases. Whereas I would say that like looking at the positive effects is something that we should sort of take into consideration, and I should be sort of weighed against the risk of negative effects. But just in general, I think I'm very much in favor of sort of taking it slow and making sure that we know what we're doing. And I think there's definitely I can see a potential possible future where we would increase our understanding of the natural world, would increase our capability to sort of reliably make changes. And I think that if we do find ways that we can improve the lives of wild animals, and we're as a sort of global society where we can to some degree agree on that, like we should implement a certain intervention to that might have positive benefits for humans and wild animals or whatever, then I think that could be really good, especially then with this sort of increased capability and knowledge and ability to predict outcomes. But obviously I don't think we're there yet, but that is why we would need a lot more research.
Yeah, just touching on that distinction between causing harm and kind of allowing harm to happen. I think a lot of people find it intuitive that causing harm is worse, and a lot of people have the position that like it's our obligation not to cause harm, but we have no obligation to actually intervene and make things better. And I think maybe even, in my early vegan days, maybe this was something that I found intuitive as well. I guess I think that, I can imagine a thought experiment where, let's say that rather than factory farming happening in the way it does, factory farming occurred naturally. So we have slaughterhouses and factory farms that are growing naturally, sprouting up like a mushroom in the forest, and animals are suffering exactly the same way, but there's no human perpetrator. It seems to me clear that it's not like the problem has vanished. It seems like I have just as much reason to intervene and help the animals because they're suffering. And I think, something that's inherent in suffering is like an urgency for the situation to change. And it doesn't make a difference from say the animal's perspective, whether or not the same amount of suffering is being caused by a human or by a rock falling on them in the forest, or in my hypothetical, the natural slaughterhouses. So yeah, while I think it seems intuitive that like there is this distinction, and maybe there's even like psychological reasons why we might perhaps get more angry if there's a perpetrator. Maybe we've evolved to kind of dislike cheaters and dislike people who cause harm. But I think that when we really put ourselves in the perspective of the individual who's suffering, it really doesn't seem that distinction is morally relevant. But just to go back to what you were saying, because it seems I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who has this perspective that like, no, this is way too complicated and you're going to make things worse. And it sounds like you're saying all the right things. You're saying, look, we're going to take it slow. We want to do loads of research, make sure that we're in a good place in the future and able to like know the outcomes of our actions, and we want to make sure that it's reversible in case things do potentially get worse. And then there's the point you made about the fact that we're kind of already intervening in nature, only we're doing it without really considering the perspective of the wild animals in most cases. But that being said, what would you say to someone who would have the thought that, okay, you can say all this stuff, you can say you're going to be careful, but when we look through the track record of human beings, it seems that we're doing a lot of damage to nature, even when we're not particularly trying to?
Yeah, I guess would say that I think to a large extent the damage we're currently doing to whatever we're like depends on what we're talking about. But let's say the amount of land that is sort of somewhat undisturbed habitats, comparing the current state with a few hundred years ago or even like 1,000 years ago. So we're sort of increasingly modifying natural world. I think we're doing that to suit our own interests, to fulfill our like to be able to produce the food that we need to continue existing, to basically all the things that I'm using right now, the microphone, the webcam, the computer, all these things are made out of different types of metals, these rare earth minerals, and they need to be dug out to well, sometimes you do make a quarry and it's not much of an effect, but quite often you have these sort of big gaping holes in the ground, and that has an effect on obviously on wild animals and plants and ecosystems. And so I think we're doing all of these things for almost exclusively for our own benefit, and we're trying to do it in a way that is sort of sustainable, and quite often we're failing. And so I think global warming is a good example of that. But yeah, it's mainly doing things that is like, let's try to minimize the negative side effects while we make things good for ourselves in some sense. That would make it very simple. And so I think that's a bit of a different case. That's like, you're not, I mean, obviously there are projects where you specifically try to maybe restore some type of habitat. Maybe you're trying to prevent biodiversity loss, species extinction, or something like that. And in those cases, then yes, your goal is to sort of mitigate the effects that are caused by our other activities. But quite often, I'd say the bulk of our activities is just things that are good for us and accidentally harm the rest of the sort of natural systems. And so I think if we're looking at doing things for the benefit of wild animals to improve their welfare, that is in this other category where we are sort of actively trying to do something that is either sort of like mitigating some other effect that we might have on animals. That quite often I think it's going to be quite easier to make changes where we are already present. That I think that might be sort of a more or less a first stepping stone, but then also trying to help wild animals that aren't as much directly impacted by humans. I guess it's hard to completely avoid human impact at this point, but yeah, so I think I don't think it's exactly the same thing. I think it's more useful to compare it to, as you say, some type of restoration or conservation work, where you're actually trying to like do for where you are sort of intervening in a sense. You're trying to make things better for either, in the conservation case, to, like, restoring the system to a previous state, or avoiding further changes that would be bad. And in the welfare case, trying to make sure that wild animals have better lives without negative affecting humans or non-wild animals.
Yeah, so I guess when we look back and we see previous human intervention in nature, those interventions have primarily been done for human interests, to improve human well-being. So yeah, it seems very unfair to like look at interventions that haven't been done with the purpose of improving the lives of wild animals and then conclude, look at those interventions, they made things worse in whatever way you think worse means, and therefore we won't be able to improve the lives of wild animals. There's like an analogy that popped up in my head, but I don't know if it actually holds, because it just, I have uncertainty about the things that pop up in my head being good ideas to talk about. But it kind of seems like if we are like creating food products in our society purely based on like pleasure, for instance, and then someone says, hey, let's make healthy food for everybody and we'll improve our well-being. And then people say, no, look at the past of human history. We've been making all these interventions to food, and look, it's actually making things worse. And it's like, well, we haven't actually tried to make things better. So yeah, how on earth can we conclude that we'll definitely make things worse? It seems kind of silly.
Yeah, that might be. I see where you're going with an analogy. I guess it's like with humans. I think it's almost always the case that we're making changes with our sort of well-being in mind, and I think that is that makes it hard to find cases where we're just like randomly making changes to our diet, for instance, and then suddenly figure out that, we should do something that is good for us. I think there are other examples of this the sort of process that you're describing. I think, for instance, so one concrete example that we might get into later, but with wildlife contraception, what we've done so far, so we've actually used contraception for wild animals for quite some time. There's been work going on since I think the 70s, maybe even earlier, where we've developed wildlife contraceptives. We've tested it in a bunch of different species. There are not that many that are commercially available, but there are a lot of studies on many different species, mostly mammals, I should say, but there are contraceptives that can be used for birds, and depending on how you define a contraceptive, there are cases where you could sort of inhibit reproduction in insects, ants to be specific. But then, yeah, the question is like, how are they somewhat harmful? It seems like it might be the case. Anyway, I think it's a good example of this thing where you are using a method that has been used to help humans in some way, in different ways to sort of mitigate human wildlife conflicts. You're maybe you're sort of in a pickle because you need to reduce the population of deer in a sort of urban area, and you can't hunt there because there's houses around and people live in there, and like which I think is good. There's a lot of what do you call it? You don't have you would have some public opposition if you try to use, for instance, poison, things like that. And so, yeah, I think those are. It's good that we're trying to find sort of alternatives to just hunting and poisoning things, especially certain types of poisons are fairly slow acting and probably very sort of painful to die from. But yeah, so then you might try to use contraceptives, but it's always with the focus of how can we solve this problem for humans without causing any sort of additional harm to, or not that much harm to the wild animals you're trying to deal with. That has been the case so far. I think that there's a good argument to be made for making the lives of wild animals better by using contraceptives. And I think we can't really take what has been sort of been the track record and apply it to what we think would happen if we try to improve wild animal welfare. I think there are certain side effects you can see. You can also see some positive benefits. There's not much data, but I think it's very much encouraging, and I think would benefit from more research on the specific question of like, can you improve welfare by using contraceptives on wild animals? But yeah, I think that is a sort of good example of you're just you're looking at a method that is being used to help humans in some way without causing undue harm to wild animals. But then what you actually want to sort of to make a decision of whether this is a good idea or not in terms of wild animal welfare, you'd want to know if we really tried, what would happen. If we really applied rigorous science over time, we'd be able to figure out ways to make this work well.
I think the example you gave of contraception is like an interesting one, and since you think that's a promising way to potentially help wild animals significantly, I think we'll spend a bit of time talking about that later in this episode. I think we should just maybe round off the point that a lot of people have, which is that since ecosystems are so complicated and interconnected, like how can we possibly know that we're going to make things better, and surely won't we make things worse if we try and intervene? And there's a point that you made a few times, which is that essentially we're already intervening in like an endless number of ways. We're intervening from the buildings we build, we're intervening in the food we eat, we're intervening with the environmentalist policies. So really, it's no longer a question anymore of should we intervene in the lives of wild animals or not. The question that we're left with is, how do we want to intervene? And one way of answering that question would be to ask ourselves, what if it were me living through the consequences that we create? What if we had to live through the lives of the beings that were affected? We could decide to try and shape the ways we're impacting lives of wild animals to have a positive impact on them, to improve their well-being and make the world a good place to live for them. Or we could just say, look, like we're not sure how the outcomes would be positive, so we're just going to kind of continue intervening without really seriously considering how we're impacting them. And like the other analogy that I originally heard from Brian Tomasic was that this idea of a system being like so complex and interconnected that we shouldn't intervene. Well, people could have said the same thing about the human body a long time ago, before we had before we conducted the research and had like modern medicine. people could have said, what's the point in intervening in the human body? It's so incredibly complex and interconnected, and you might improve one thing but then make something else worse. Surely we should just leave it alone. And that's not what we did. In order to improve human well-being, we did the research to learn about how the human body works, and we do intervene in the human body, but not willy-nilly. We're careful about what we consider and what we don't consider doing, and when the evidence suggests that we'll have a positive impact, then we do that. And I think there's lots of examples of really amazing things we've done to improve human lives by intervening in the human body, and I don't see any reason in theory why this couldn't also be the case for intervening in like an even more complex, larger system like nature. But do you have anything you want to say, just to like kind of finish on this this question of like how intervening in nature, it's so complex and huge, like surely this is like a ridiculous thing to consider?
Yeah, I think to touch on what you just said, I think there's there's somewhat of a difference between making, like, trying to figure out how the human body works by treating it in different ways, trying different compounds, eating them and see what happens, or whatever, like different ways of treating illnesses. I think that that can be similar to the question of making changes to the natural system, but I think it's all sort of depends on what scale we are making changes. So I think to the extent that we can make sort of smaller, isolated changes to see what effect seems to be without making sort of irreversible changes. I think that is a good way to go, and when that is possible. I think, but I do think it's a bit of a different story if we're talking about like the whole like Earth as a whole interconnected system, where if we make changes big enough, then you'd have it's basically like doing an experiment on the last person on Earth. I guess the last two, you'd need another one, and so that would be, I would be a bit a bit more. I would be more cautious in that case. But yeah, I agree. Like, I think there's just as we do experiments to try to figure out what the effects are in terms of other human activities, it makes sense to do it in a sort of responsible way, and on appropriately small scale when it comes to trying to make changes to ecosystems.
What are some other reasons you think people might be pessimistic about research on helping wild animals?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. Something that we haven't touched upon that much so far is the question of which animals are sentient, and so have the capacity to experience the world, basically. And I think I know at least some people that have expressed some sort of skepticism about which animals that are capable of experiencing the world. And I think it's also it's sort of interrelated in sort of a bundle of questions or concerns about not knowing what it's like to be another animal. And I guess I share the concern about not knowing which species are sentient. I think that is something that's tricky. I think ultimately we can't just avoid the question. If we're making decisions, we're sort of implicitly putting judgments on certain propositions and claims. So I think there's quite a lot of uncertainty in terms of which animals are sentient, but I'm not certain. Like, there are a lot of animals that I'm definitely not certain that they are insentient. There's a lot of arthropods, or just generally invertebrates, small worms and insects and all of that, where I'd say it's just very unclear whether they are sentient or not. And generally, I wouldn't put an extremely low number or percentage in terms of probability on them being sentient. Maybe if we're talking about like plants or something, that the probability of them having some form of experience of the world will go way down. But I'd say for animals that at least have this sort of the rudimentary system that seems to be able to produce conscious experiences, it's just unclear. And so I think that means that we need to take that possibility seriously.
One point that's maybe worth raising is that, even if invertebrates weren't sentient, even if we didn't like include them in the equation, we'd still be looking at like, in terms of the amount of total suffering in wild animal suffering would still be like the largest issue, even if we didn't include invertebrates.
Yeah.
And I think the other question was like about not knowing, what it is like to be an animal. And I guess like one point is that for me, like, I guess I take kind of like a prioritarian view where I feel like the beings who are the worse off should kind of get the welfare improvements. And when you look at nature, like, it seems like there's lots of examples of like really intense negative experiences. And sure, I don't know what it's like to be an elephant, but I think that like being like slowly eaten alive over hours is like definitely going to be a negative experience. And there's like plenty of like parasites that like slowly kill animals over like extended periods of time. And I just think there's like lots of examples of extreme suffering that we could probably kind of agree we don't know what it's exactly like to be the animal, but like that seems pretty negative.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's I think there are definitely cases where it's you'd have to tie yourself into knots to avoid agreeing that is an unpleasant and bad experience for the animal, and that the animal is likely to be sentient. But I think that so that is one of the objections that I've heard. But yeah, as I said, I think that like conditional on being sentient, I think there are things we can quite reliably say are good and bad for the welfare of the individual. But obviously complicated by the fact that any changes you make to help one individual would sort of ripple out into effects on other individuals and other species, and just makes it harder. But that just makes it more complex and not in principle unsolvable. So that is one objection that I've heard. And I guess other examples of objections could be something related to a lack of moral obligation to help wild animals. I think we've touched upon that previously a bit. And I guess I think there are ways that you could sort of build your moral framework, like the way you think that you ought to act in the world, such that by that framework you shouldn't, or at least there's no obligation to help wild animals. But I do think that most people have at least like they make room for just more positive experiences are better than negative experiences, and that they make room for the possibility of a lot of like different animals being sentient and those kinds of things. So I think that is, I mean, it depends on what sort of moral system you're operating from, but I think it's for most people that might not be sort of the main issue. I think another common example is that the thing that you talked about quite a bit, the question of whether we're able to reliably make improvements given the things, and not just that we don't know what it's like to be an animal, but the world is very complex. I think that is one of the arguments that I feel the weight of the most. I do think it goes for basically everything we do. Like there's once you've agreed that wild animal welfare matters, if you agree with that, then if you don't say, okay, I don't really know how to help wild animals, you're still very likely to affect wild animals if you do something else. And so I think it's a bit of a thorny issue that, especially if you look far into the future, that if you do care about future humans or future animals, then things you do now will quite like just very minute actions and differences in behavior will sort of ripple out over time, and it will be kind of hard to know exactly what the effects are. And so, I would say that is one of the objections that I find quite compelling. I don't think it is a devastating objection, but I think it's definitely something that we'd want to keep an eye on and try to figure out if there are any good sort of reasonably robust signposts for going in a positive direction. I think building a research community and sort of increasing our understanding and our capability to improve wild animal welfare seems like one of those positive signposts. But that is an objection that I think is valid to some extent, at least.
One of the things you mentioned that you were optimistic about was contraception. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And so contraception obviously been used in humans for some time, but then also developed in different forms for wild animals, and mostly mammals, birds, and a few other species. And so what we've seen from the quite sparse empirical evidence is that there's some indication that you'd have beneficial effects in some cases. So you might have increased longevity, or there's some indication of improving the body condition, like having more fat, or less affected by starvation. It is a bit tricky because I think some hormonal treatments basically make animals hungrier, and so what happens is that there might be a trade-off between eating and doing something else, and that sort of could push them in the direction of choosing to eat. But that's not really like helping them. If they made sort of that trade-off for a good reason, we might sort of be pushing them in a suboptimal direction. Like it's probably not good to just have every animal eat no matter what. Like if their leg is broken, maybe they should rest more and not just eat, or maybe they should spend some time avoiding being predated on or whatever. And so I think it's a bit tricky, and the data is not that good. But there are also sort of theoretical reasons why we might expect contraceptives to have a positive effect on wild animal welfare in some contexts, and under certain conditions. I don't think it's going to help to just pick any random species and pick a method or a drug that a contraceptive that works for that species and then just deliver it and hope for the best. I think we'd want to think about what happens specifically when you give this contraceptive to this animal or the species. What do they like if they don't if they have fewer offspring per unit time? What will they do instead? Will they do something that is beneficial for their welfare? Maybe they'll eat. They'll be able to use those resources on themselves and the remaining offspring, or would they just try to mate for longer? So they're like, okay, I'm still searching for a mate to produce offspring. Then that might be actually even more energetically demanding. And so there are a bunch of cases where I think you could. There are reasons to think that certain contexts are going to be more beneficial for welfare improvements than others. The reason that we expect positive effects from contraceptives sort of in general is related to resource scarcity. So if you have a large population and it's roughly at carrying capacity, which means the size of the population that the environment can sort of sustainably sustain. And if you have that population at that size, and let's assume that there are no predators, which is almost always not the case, or quite often not the case, you'd have some resource limiting the size of the population. So you would have a lack of one or multiple resources being the reason for the population not growing anymore. And so that just seems like almost an a priori reason for welfare to be impacted negatively. So if you don't have enough food, then you'd experience more hunger. If you don't have enough water or whatever, that you would have other feelings of thirsts. That all of these things are sort of negative experiences. And so it could be the case that if you reduce the population size to some level below the maximum capacity, then you'd have more resources per individual in the population and less fierce competition. And this could go for just in general across the population. If you're comparing two individuals that are unrelated or they're just in the same area, if there previously were 4 individuals in that area and now there's 2, they will have more food to gather perhaps. And if you're looking within a nest, if we're talking about birds, for instance, you might have fewer siblings to compete with, so there's more time that can be spent on you, whatever other siblings that are born, and there's more resources that can go into improving your lives and making sure you don't starve. So that's sort of the short version. I'm working on a paper to sort of explore these sort of potential positive effects of contraception, wildlife contraception. There has been previous research looking at whether there are sort of negative side effects or harmful effects from using contraception, which I think is obviously very useful, and that is sort of my based. I've looked at those studies and it's very helpful. But yeah, it's going to be somewhat of a different question, trying to think about how to, whether there are ways to actively improve the welfare of wild animals using contraceptives.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just try and like summarize what I understand back to you, and you can tell me like if I'm on the money or completely off track here. But are you saying that like, so essentially there is an issue of resource scarcity in nature, so animals are like routinely dying of starvation, dehydration, lack of habitats, etc. And also I guess this issue is going to be bigger than we probably anticipate, because when an animal becomes very dehydrated or is suffering from starvation, they're probably going to be more susceptible to like different diseases and also being eaten by predators. So it really is probably like a significant source of misery for wild animals, this lack of enough resources to go around. And of course, like, you know, we can't even just look at the number of like deaths from like starvation or dehydration, because many animals will be like suffering from like chronic hunger and not die. So like there are moments in my life where I've been like extremely hungry, but like I haven't been on the verge of death, and it still sucks. And obviously like someone might intuitively say, oh, I'll just like give them, you know, let's just give them food. But of course, like if we were to provide more food, then presumably the number of animals that survive would go up, so that so similar levels of like starvation and dehydration would like occur because the population increases as you provide more resources. And I guess it's that kind of pattern that maybe makes it more likely for people to think that like this is just a problem that we cannot solve. It's just like too complicated, and we can't make things better. However, you're suggesting that like contraception can be used to reduce the population sizes of animals. So essentially there are more resources to go around without a corresponding increase in population size. Are there examples of this kind of like working on a small scale, or is this something you're looking to do in the future?
Yeah, so I've seen there's some research on horses, primarily from, or I think exclusively from within the United States, and they've seen in several studies, I think mainly from, I'm not sure exactly when, but I think 90s, roughly, maybe early 2000. There's probably more research being done still. Well, I know there is. In any case, they've studied the effects of contraceptives on horses. I think they're using something called PCP, but with a Z in the middle. And they've seen that in a few studies where they looked at survival or longevity, they've seen that it has increased. I think they also saw that juvenile survival that increase in I think it was at least one study that looked at that. So I think that seems like a fairly clear case where it seems to have a positive effect. Then there's some studies on rabbits in Australia, I think, where they've actually used something that I don't think is that promising as a method, but I guess it sort of falls under the same category, which is surgical sterilization. So they basically, I think, remove the ovaries or something like that. And that, I think, if the I think that there are better ways that might be. I shouldn't say that I know that there are better ways right now to implement fertility control for rabbits in Australia, but I think there are generally better ways, and we can probably develop better ways than surgical sterilization. But in that case, with the rabbits, they also did see an increase in survival. And then there's a bunch of papers where they've seen increases in body weight, especially in treated females and in sometimes in juveniles. Actually, I'm not sure about that. They might have. I know there's increases in survival, but yeah. And so those are some intriguing examples. I think it is tricky to determine, I think there's not enough studies looking at this question, especially not enough studies where you've actually designed the study such that you're trying to improve the welfare of wild animals. I think for obvious reasons, that would be the most promising. If you're like, okay, this is the method of action, and this is sort of, we have some background theory for how this could improve the welfare of these animals. I think it's more likely that you'd achieve that if you're actually trying, rather than sort of randomly ending up there, or at least not trying to harm, but not explicitly trying to reap these benefits.
Yeah, as you're alluding to, I guess like with these examples, the contraception wasn't actually designed for the purpose of like improving welfare in these animals. And, you know, I guess if we were to continue down this like train of thought of improving lives of wild animals using contraception, the technology being used would be, you know, better suited to that purpose, so the outcomes would be better. But you know, let's imagine that you kind of using research, you work out what the optimal population size within a certain area is of a species for their welfare. I guess changing the population size of this species is of course going to have like ripple effects to like lots of other groups of animals as well. So like, how can you be sure that the overall impact is actually positive and not just making things worse?
That's a very good question, and I'd say at this point you can't be sure. Like obviously we don't really know, have sort of clear concrete examples where like we have some suggestive evidence of it being positive. We have some theoretical reasons to expect positive effects, and this has been like that. These theoretical reasons have been alluded to in other papers where they actually don't focus specifically on trying to improve welfare. So it's a perfectly valid point. I think this gets at, if we sort of zoom out a bit, I think this piece of the puzzle, implementing fertility control or actually doing research on the welfare effects of fertility control, is what I see as some type of intermediate step. So I think that having at least some concrete examples of where we could actually improve the welfare of the target species and not have sort of the immediate effects on the environment or other animals be clearly negative. I think that is at least something that would be really valuable. That would demonstrate that we can sort of find, if we sort of specifically look for it, we can find ways to improve the lives of wild animals on sort of that scale. And obviously I don't think we should settle for that and say we've, all things considered, we improved wild animal welfare overall. But I think it's something that is likely to be a toolbox, or sort of a tool in the toolbox that we can use later on. And if we have the, like, if, as we talked about before, if we can be confident that we know what we're doing, we understand how different ecosystems work, we have way more knowledge and an increased capacity to make changes, then, and of course sort of political will and agreement that this is something we want to do, then I think this sort of method is going to be quite crucial or useful for achieving sort of positive effects on wildlife and welfare. Some way of mitigating resource competition.
Are there any other points that you think it could be important to make about contraceptives before we move on to a different question?
Yeah, so this is one other thing that I think that is something that I think it's easy to overlook, but it's an objection I've heard a few times, and I think it's a valid one and a useful one, and that's the question about, well, you're trying to reduce population sizes, or a specific size of a specific population. Couldn't you do that some other way? For instance, through culling, or basically killing animals. And so the answer to whether it's possible, the answer is yes, you can. Like, we do that all the time as a society with poisons or guns or whatever. And I just think that it's not the most promising method as far as I can see. There are a couple of these more nuanced details about the effects on welfare that it seems to come out of using contraception, but doesn't come out of lethal methods. So, for instance, if you use contraception, you'd have maybe fewer offspring being born per unit time, but quite often you see, so there's some studies showing this, you have an increased survival of juveniles, sort of recruitment to adulthood. And so what happens is that you'd have sort of life expectancy is increased, and you'd have fewer deaths per unit time, which, all else equal, at least, seems like a good thing. Having a lot of individuals born and then dying very close to being born means that they, like, a big chunk of their experience is just the experience of dying. And so the positive pieces in an animal's life is likely going to be everything else before they die. So that is a very sort of rough argument, and I'm not very sure that would bear out if you'd actually look, but it seems plausible that that's the case. And then there's another argument where it's sort of similar to what I was just explaining with having juveniles survive until adulthood. So if you're using contraceptives, you would then reduce the number of juveniles born, and so, but more, like, a larger fraction would survive. And that means that you're sort of shifting the demography of the population so that you have more adults and fewer young individuals. And if it's the case that being a juvenile of this whatever particular species we're looking at, and perhaps on average for most species. If it's if the positive experiences are more common for adult individuals, and the juvenile life stage is generally not a pleasant one, especially if because the mortality is usually higher for juveniles, not always, but quite often, then you'd expect that you have high mortality as juvenile, you might experience a lot of hardship, and when you become an adult, you have a better, more pleasant life. And so having larger fraction of juveniles surviving until adulthood and sort of shifting the population from lots of juveniles that die young to more individuals with longer lives, live until adulthood, that would then be a good thing, because you'd sort of take away from the part of the life, like the life stage that has the lowest welfare, and be sort of pushing it into the life stage that has better welfare. So that's another reason that where it seems like if you're using contraceptives, you would have this effect. But if you're using, if you're sort of increasing the mortality, you're killing individuals, then, and it depends a bit on for what life stage is impacted, but if it's sort of uniform, that sort of randomly picking individuals, then you'd have almost the opposite effect, that the life expectancy would decrease. You're just sort of increasing mortality, and you wouldn't get this shift into more individuals surviving until adulthood. So those are sort of kind of nitty-gritty details, and yeah, I wouldn't say I'm 100% sure, but I think in general it's also something that I think a lot of people can get behind, and I think to the extent that we do think that we should avoid killing animals unnecessarily, then I think contraception is a way to, as a method that you at least avoid that, and yeah, for a number of reasons I can think of, I think that's a good thing, apart from just the effects on changes in the size and the demography of the population.
Yeah. Another thought that came to my head was that, I don't know, I guess it seems that a large part of what animal advocates are doing are trying to create a culture of like caring towards animals, try and create these like attitudes of caring towards animals, and maybe lethal methods of population control kind of goes against that and might hinder that moral circle expansion. And yeah, I agree with you that like contraception seems like something that people are more likely to get behind, especially considering that we can think of examples where we're already going to intervene to control the population sizes of animals for like conservationist or environmental reasons. I kind of think like, you know, like, so there's one method of controlling the population size of like trophic rewilding, increasing like introducing wolves to like eat them alive, and that seems like terrible from a welfare perspective. And then you've got the option where you like lethal methods of like killing them, which also seems like problematic, I think, to like the general public. And then you've got like the contraception method, which seems more like it seems like a more humane option out of the three.
Yeah, I think it has benefits on sort of different moral frameworks, and also seems to at least preliminary be like what so far, as far as I can tell, seems like it would have some benefits that lethal methods don't have in terms of the direct effects. Yeah, I think.
Yeah. So the next steps in terms of like learning more about contraceptives, what exactly is it? So like, what are the next steps for What Initiative in this area?
Yeah, so I think there we're actually trying to find other researchers that is one big part of our mission and the activities we engage in. So try to find researchers who are interested and willing to study these questions, like some of the questions we've been talking about, and so having a research group focus on this question of what are the welfare effects of contraceptives in like some species where we find it likely that it would have positive effects. That would be extremely useful. I think even just looking at the welfare effects of the use of contraceptives when it isn't intended to be improving wild animal welfare is also useful. It's a bit tricky to find a sort of target species or compound that is sort of readily available, commercially available, and that you're sort of able to use fairly easily. So there are a few examples of contraceptives that are commercially available. So there's something called Ovocontrol that is currently available as a product you can buy in the US. There are versions of it containing the same active ingredient, the carbazone, in other places of the world. So, for instance, in some countries in Europe. And it is used to control pigeon populations. And so that is something that is a quite interesting example where there might be some benefits. There are also some energetic trade-offs that make it we might expect some counteracting effects, where pigeons tend to lay eggs even though they aren't fertilized, and producing eggs is quite energetically costly. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that we're interested in, given that it's already available, and I think people are generally in favor of not harming pigeons and potentially helping them, and two, if we're gonna do something like try out a way to improve their welfare, they'd be happy to. I think people are more positively inclined to those types of projects being conducted in already sort of semi-natural or unnatural environments, such as urban areas and cities. And then there's also another product that's called Contrapest that is being used to control rodent populations in the US. And that's also quite interesting, especially given the high sort of fertility of rats. And so if you have a lot of offspring and not a lot of them make it until adulthood, then having fewer that survive seems like, as I talked about before, that seems like something that would be positive. But yeah, a lot of this is just sort of speculation, and it would be very interesting to see some research on those kinds of products.
Yeah, I think like the example of contraception for pigeons is a good one. Like when I talk to people about wild animal suffering, in the abstract, people often are, are like very uncertain and push more the idea of like, we're going to make things worse, etc. But when I give like a specific example, if I say, look, there's a problem of too many pigeons in cities and the current response is to trap them, to kill them and to poison them. And what we could do instead is we could develop, you could use contraception to reduce the population size instead. It seems a more humane way to do it. I think people intuitively are able to get on board with that. And I think you mentioned a few of the reasons why that might be the case. I mean, for instance, pigeons are kind of seem less separate from us in the sense that like they're not like they're already living like with us in urban areas, so maybe that makes a difference. And also, since we're already trying to control the population sizes of pigeons in many cases, that's perhaps another reason why like people are more likely to get on board with that intervention. But yeah, I guess like if we can just have like studies on pigeons and like look at the welfare effects of that, then perhaps we can learn more about how it works and scale it up at a later date to help more individuals. And just like moving away from the contraception, unless there's like more you want to say about it. Is there anything else you want to say about contraception?
I guess really briefly, I just want to mention that because I think you asked that before. If we're now looking at the specific sort of potential intervention, the sort of promising way to improve welfare, the welfare of wild animals, there's this sort of tension with, well, what are the sort of unintended consequences? Are there sort of ripple effects, and like is it possible to tell what the sort of total effect is beyond just the target species or target individuals? And I think I don't remember exactly what I said, but I think it's a very good question. I think what we want to do is to get people to do research. I think it's partly something that I think is sort of more likely than not to actually be beneficial, but it's also a way that we could get. And I think that might perhaps even be the important point, that it's a way to show that it's sort of possible. What you just said about being able to tell others that here's a method where it seems like we could actually help these individuals. I think that is for people to have some type of mental step between where we are at the moment and like robustly improving the lives of wild animals. It's just there's some or maybe multiple intermediate steps that are missing, and so it's useful to have something where it's like, well, we can take smaller steps, and from there we can build further as we learn more. But I don't expect some of the first steps we're making to be like ready-made solutions, so it's like, we can just chip away at this forever or we'll solve it. I think it's more like, there's a sort of promising method, let's study the method and see what happens on the sort of smaller scale and sort of direct effects, and obviously then we'll try to build on that and other ways that we could sort of look at how it might affect other species and individuals or ecosystems. So I think, I'd want to add that. I think that's an important point.
Yeah. So as I mentioned to you before we started filming, that I'm currently working on a YouTube video, like kind of going over the ways in which wild animals suffer, and that like involves me watching like a lot of really like terrible videos of animals like suffering very intensely, and I'm just thinking that there seems to be this balance between seeing these videos and kind of coming to the realization that like, okay, like right now, right at this moment, there are animals essentially like going through torture, like suffering that is unbearable, and there's like this very, very strong sense of urgency when I think about these things, because that urgency is inherent in the suffering they're going through. Like they need help. but then we're also talking about how important it is to like have these intermediate steps and like do lots of research and build this like research field, and like it's going to take a lot of time. And I'm wondering like how you think about this balance. Like, do you feel this sense of urgency, and do you find yourself frustrated that we have that that we kind of have to have this like long-term view and like kind of take things slowly, starting with like very small populations, etc.?
Yeah, I think I very much feel that that is sort of unsatisfying. I think to some extent I try to avoid thinking about the actual individual animals. I do get a bit, I feel very sad if I like see an injured animal, and I don't know. I think it's kind of hard for me to sort of absorb it, and I know that it's there, and it's something that I think, I don't know. I think I've just noticed that for me at least, it sort of almost gets me down to the point where I just feel sad and depressed, and not sort of excited or wanting to do something. Is more of a feeling of a sort of almost intense sadness, and especially having a dog, and sort of really wanting to protect him from bad stuff in the world. It also gets quite I don't know. To some extent, it's almost even more vivid what it would mean for an animal to suffer, at least for the ones that are sort of, I guess, more similar to us. So I'd say I probably try to avoid it. Avoid thinking too much about it. But certainly on some sort of basic level, I think I'm very much motivated by that feeling. I guess it's, I don't know. I don't know if you've read the book Against Empathy, but I think it's Paul Bloom, psychologist.
No, it's been recommended to me multiple times, but I've never read it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think I shouldn't say that I've based sort of my my idea of not thinking too much about the sort of vivid experiences of wild animals that are suffering, but in the book he talks about it being useful to show sort of to have compassion and try to help others, and that being more of a like, I guess, less of an emotional trait and more of a cognitive trait, like taking your intuitions and then thinking through what they mean in terms of what you ought to do. Whereas the sort of direct empathy, where you really just feel like this all depends on exactly how you define these terms. But then empathy in this case would be just feeling someone else's feelings. And that can sometimes make you very much focused on that particular individual or the feelings you have in relation to them, to that individual, and try to have that go away, instead of maybe like you become very preoccupied with what's here and now in front of you, which, I mean, sometimes is useful, but I think at least for the kind of work that I do, it is useful to sort of be able to step back and think about it a bit more abstractly, even though I'm definitely sort of, I chose this work because of it, because I feel that it's important. There's like a strong intuition. So that's it's tricky, but
So like in one sense, it seems like wild animal suffering is largely invisible to humans, and that seems like an enormous problem. And like a large part of maybe what we need to do is to like kind of bring this issue to the awareness of people. But yeah, on the other hand, you're talking about how, I don't know, I guess like in a sense, maybe like really empathizing with like the individuals who are going through unbearable suffering is somewhat like paralyzing. And maybe once you kind of understand, okay, like the situation is fucked for a lot of animals out there, like it's really terrible, I can put that away and now like just focus on doing something about it. Rather than just kind of going back to like, oh my god, this is really bad, it's like, okay, I know that now, let's like focus on like doing something about it, and like not really like stay in that place of like feeling like kind of thinking about, you know, the animals being eaten alive at every moment. So
I think that, I mean, there are sometimes even that there's some sort of interplay between these two, because sometimes it is actually useful to I mean, if you're watching a nature documentary and there's you see like a depiction, or even just like some recording of some event, recording of a predation event, recording of an injured animal or something like that, it can help you sort of, if you haven't experienced that in sort of real life or something like that, that would probably be worse. But if you look at a video of that could actually help you calibrate like your intuitions about what this experience would be like. So it's sort of like I guess bit of an anecdotal data point in some sense, but I sometimes I find it useful if you're just looking at just like a spreadsheet or a table where it just says number of individuals that lived a certain age, or like presence or absence of a certain disease, or like symptoms of something. It's a bit of a different, like you'd want to sort of get that into some sort of some prediction in terms of welfare, and ideally you'd have like a proper system for doing that. But sometimes if for me at least, then if I'm looking at something and it's some cause of death or some something that is detrimental to welfare, then it can sort of give a bit of an understanding of what it would be like in terms of the welfare effects.
So looking to like your hopes for the future, and maybe we can do this like near term, medium term, and long term, and you can kind of define that as you will. Like what would be your hopes for the future? I guess I don't want to say like, you know, not your ideal, but like what do you think is like a realistic kind of aim for the near term, medium, and like long term for the cause area of wild animal suffering?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess near term, I'd hope for sort of sustained increase in doing research on wild animal welfare. Seeing more research being done, and maybe like developing some type of workshop or conference or something like that, to have a common forum. I think that would be very useful. And sort of medium term, if that would then be I don't know what that would be, but I'd say 50 years from now, is that medium term?
Yeah, sounds reasonable.
Okay. That, I guess, yeah. So I would. It's tricky because you'd want to look at what happened in the last 50 years, but I mean, it's hard to know whether we can just extrapolate past changes into the future and you'd have the same rate of change. I think that it's not necessarily a sort of completely safe assumption. But yeah, I think what I would hope for is that you'd have not necessarily something we'd call a field, but like the interesting question is how much useful research is being done on wild animal welfare. So at that point, I think it would be useful, like, to not just have the research being done, but having some participation from the rest of society in trying to interpret the research and thinking about policy, and like these, maybe if there are small scale experiments that have been carried out, like trying to build on those, and sort of expand from there. If we've found by then clear cases, there's like, this seems to be like robustly good intervention, then having people advocate for that and it being tested and implemented in different parts of the world. I think that'd be great. I think there's sort of we shouldn't rush that those kinds of developments, and sort of depends on where we are at that point in terms of how well we understand the effects. But yeah, that is what I'd hope to see at that point. And for the longer term effects, I guess that could be anything from, I don't know, 100 years out and beyond. I think that it's just extremely hard to first of all predict, and so if I'd want to say what I'd like it to look like within what I think is reasonable to actually happen, that is already quite hard for, I think, anyone to. But I think that if we make sure that we sort of increase our knowledge and our capability, and we don't completely change the way we look at sort of helping animals, I think we'd want to see I'd rather see that we sort of continue to sort of, let me say it like this. I'd want to see more concern for animal welfare, like not just wild animals, but farmed animals as well. But I would not want drastic change in any sort of in the other direction of less concern for animals, and so having like increased concern for wild animals and knowledge and capacity to make changes in the world that are beneficial for wild animal welfare is, I think, sort of the three key ingredients that we need, like the will to help, the knowledge of how, and the capacity to actually do it. But yeah, I guess so there's lots of things you could say about the really long-term future in terms of what what I'd hope for wild animals. I think it's one of the things that I think it's important to think about is trying to avoid locking in states that would persist for a long time if we at least if we don't know the effects of it. So first figuring out whether it's a change we'd want to make, and then making that change. So while we are uncertain about the effects and we're sort of gathering information, the value of information is really high when you're really unsure. So then you'd want to preserve the what's called the option value, or the ability to make changes if you've realized that it's not a good choice or not the best choice. So yeah, that is what I hope, that we will not make too rash decisions that are hard to reverse before that future.
Hopefully we'll have radical life extension in our over our lives, and then we can have a conversation about this in 80 years.
Exactly.
And be blown away by the progress we've made.
That would be cool.
Yeah, I guess I'll end by thanking you for what you're doing. You seem like a very intelligent person, so I'm sure you could be doing things to maximize income, but instead you're working to make the world a better place to live for some of the beings who I think need it most. So yeah, thank you for everything you're doing.
Thanks. Yeah, that's nice to hear. I enjoy working with these questions as well, I should say. So it's sort of rewarding in many ways.
Okay, so you've just made it to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for watching, and it's great that you're taking such an interest in making the lives of wild animals better. Just a quick reminder that all of this is possible because of the support of people like you. If you're someone who supports me on Patreon, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And if you're someone who doesn't, but you find my content valuable, then please do consider supporting me on Patreon with even a very small amount, as it really makes a difference and allows me to feel more secure in spending my time doing things like this. Okay, so with that said, thanks for watching. If you have any recommendations for people you would like me to bring on the podcast, then maybe leave a comment or drop me an email. And I'll see you very soon with the next podcast episode.